Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be getting a little bit too familiar with our neighbours. They might have already done the same to us. So for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened when I was between the ages of 11 and 12. This was a little over a decade ago. My family and I moved to Philadelphia from New York, and we loved the neighborhood. The owners of the house next door were wonderful. They didn't live there but rented out their house, and they were also from New York. She told us that she had new tenants moving in. However, the new tenants never showed their faces and never came out during the day, only at night. One time, me and my dad were out late at night, and he parked his car in the back of the house. He left out the car and unlocked the gate when we see a car pull up. Not just any car, a luxury car. We both look at each other and pretended nothing was out of the ordinary. There were two people in the car, a guy and a girl. The girl had a hoodie on and the guy had a cap on. It was dark and we couldn't see their faces. They said, "Hey, how are you?" And my dad replied, and they quickly chatted. However, the man kept his head down. I introduced myself briefly, and the woman swiftly said goodbye and they went into their house. We told our mum what we saw, but then again, he could have been renting out the car, who knows. There was another night where I heard people talking in the back, and there were a few cars parked in the back, brand new, shiny, luxury cars. There were multiple different nights where you'd hear voices and people in and out of the house at night. During winter it snowed a lot. It was around 8 a.m. where me and my siblings would go out and shovel the snow, only to discover our side shoveled, or during the fall wherein our leaves would be swept up. Another day me and my dad were going out again, and this time the same guy from last time came out and a different guy came out. The man said that he needed something fixed in his house, and then went on to say, "Hey sweetie, how are you?" I greeted him back. My dad said sure he could fix it, because we weren't going anywhere important. My dad went in there and was in for about an hour. When he returned, the guy paid my dad with a wad of cash and thanked him, and the dude quickly went inside. We got in the car, and then my dad told me the dude gave him money for something simple, and didn't want him going around the house because the house was a mess. My dad had no intention of walking around the house, but okay. My dad said there was a small door in the wall. I thought it was cool because houses with secret compartments and things of that nature, and watching movies are cool. Another few weeks go by, my siblings and my dad were in the basement just chilling, and there was this banging and loud scream coming from next door. We thought it was odd, perhaps kids playing or something. My dad left for a brief moment, and next thing you know, police cars swarmed our block and there was a helicopter ordering someone to get out. Scared, me and my siblings came outside, and you see cops going in and out the house. The cops told us to stay back, because all you see were military-grade weapons and just bags and more bags in the street. The cops asked me a few questions about them, and I just said they didn't bother anyone, and that I heard a loud scream before they came in. He was just with us and making sure we weren't scared. Then my dad came and was screaming, asking what happened. They told him about what was going on and that we were safe. The news came and started asking my dad questions or whatnot. My mum raced home from work because she saw our house on the news. And after that happened, we learnt they seized over $1 million of heroin, cocaine, weed, and many others. The weapons were dangerous, and usually the military has them, not even cops carry them. The US Marshal came the next day and told us to make sure nobody comes inside the house or knock on the door, and if they do, to call them. But that was crazy and wild. Back when we moved into our house, we were introduced to all of our neighbors by them coming to our house with cookies or brownies like they do in the movies. This was a nice, quiet, middle-class neighborhood. made up of mostly older white people and new families. I mention that because we are the only black family in the neighborhood. No black wives, husbands, not even adopted children. We didn't find it strange though. It was just very clear that we were different. I was about 13 at the time and my brother 15. Our backyard is half an acre and is fenced, but is connected to 2 other houses' backyards. Each one is half the size of ours, but we all have separate fences. So to picture it, there's a T-shaped fence separating our backyards. The house to the left was the home of an older man named Tom. He reminded me of Willie Nelson without the cool pigtails. He liked to be outside, shirtless, usually with a denim vest, no matter what the weather. He was a well-built man, but visibly kind of frail, and we found him funny in a creepy old guy kind of way. As I got older, he started making comments. I played in the backyard with my 2 dogs a lot, and Tom could see me from his living room window that faced his backyard. Whenever I glanced over, I would see him in the window, just standing there watching me. When he noticed that I saw him, he'd come out and talk to me. I tried to get away before he could come out, but sometimes I was too slow. I didn't want to make it too obvious, so I would just walk. But if I didn't make it inside, he'd yell at me to come back. I never got too close to the fence. I'd speak from a distance. He'd ask me about school, which grade I was in, and tell me I was pretty. Ask if I was old enough to have a boyfriend, and if I have an older sister or older friends that looked like me. I'd laugh it off, but after a few questions he'd stop talking and just stare at me silently. I'd always give an excuse about needing to go inside. He'd nod and stand at the fence and watch me walk back into the house, and this happened almost weekly. My mum loves to decorate, so she changes the house decor every few months. Pretty annoying actually. In one of her designing sprees, she decided to get new sliding glass doors for the back porch, which required her to take the curtains down in the living room. It took them forever to be installed, but she figured there was no point in putting the curtains back up if we were going to have to take them down again. Fine. Our family TV was in the living room. I didn't have a TV in my room, so I'd oftentimes watch TV late into the night, in the living room with my brother. One night my brother went to bed early, so I decided to watch TV by myself. Around midnight or so, I turned the TV off to go to bed. I got up from the couch, turned off the light, and turned around to see another light on. Not in my house, but in Tom's, in his living room. He was there, standing at the window, watching me. I told my parents about it later, and they shrugged it off. I'm an anxious soul by heart, so oftentimes I chalk things up to my anxiety. Fine. Soon after that, my dogs started getting sick. I'd take them out to play and they'd start throwing up or having diarrhea. We knew it wasn't their food because we'd given them nothing new. We threw away the dog treats we'd recently purchased just in case it was the problem, but it didn't stop. I noticed though, that every time I let them out alone, they'd run straight over to Tom's fence, jumping up and down, wagging their tails. He'd slowly walk outside, reach over the fence and feed them his treats, which was odd as Tom didn't have a dog. I told my parents and Dad went to talk to him, telling him the dogs were getting sick, and he apologized and stopped feeding them. They got better. A few weeks later, I was coming home from high school. My brother was in the grade above me. I was a senior, so he was in college at the time. When I got home, no one else would be home for a few more hours. I had a routine. Put my book bag upstairs, change clothes, let the dogs out of their cages out on the porch, get a snack, and then let them back in. For some reason, I was unusually excited to see my dogs that day. So instead of going upstairs, I went straight to the back porch. I got to the door to open it and saw Tom sitting on the ground in front of my dog's cages. I froze. He didn't see me. I looked over to see if the door was locked. It wasn't. I locked it as slowly as possible so it didn't make a noise, but it did. He looked over and saw me standing there. I ran upstairs and called my parents. My mom's a nurse, so she didn't have her phone on her. And my dad just never answered his phone. I didn't think it was serious enough to call the police, so I just hid. And after a moment I heard him knock on the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive though, it was almost friendly, like he wanted to talk. This time I tried calling my dad again and he answered. I was crying and telling him Tom was on the porch, and he said he was heading home now, but that he was over an hour away, and I just sat in my room waiting for my dad. The knocking stopped, my dad got home and Tom was gone. I don't know what happened between Tom and my dad, but he stopped coming outside and talking to me. He never stopped watching though, always standing in his living room. Sometimes I'd see him through the window and he'd wave, but always with the light on, just so I knew he was still there. When my parents had just had me, they moved into a not-so-great neighborhood that was crime-riddled. One thing I remember from their stories is that when I was about 2, they had a nice neighbor who had just moved in introduce himself. Can't remember the name. Point being, he came off as really nice and friendly. Said that if they ever needed anything, to just let them know. My parents were quite young when they had me, and very poor. And for some reason my dad needed a toaster for part of his thing at work. So he went over shyly and asked if he could borrow the toaster for the afternoon. The guy happily handed it to him, and when he returned it in the evening they got talking and got a little more friendly. My dad says that when he mentioned about his young son, the guy grew ever more interested. Well, one evening my mom is home alone with me, my dad working late, when all of a sudden she gets a knock at the door. It's the guy. He offers his services as a babysitter and says that if she and my dad ever need some alone time or want to go out, that he's had plenty of kids and that he's more than qualified to look after them. My mum, trying to think the best in people, just smiles and thanks for the offer, but that was the end of it, and closes the door and goes in. She got a creepy vibe from him, but couldn't shake the feeling that there was a darker motive for his visit. He was almost too sweet. Later that evening, my dad gets home from work, and she tells him about the experience, explaining how it was a bit out of the blue, if you know what I mean. My mum explains it, saying that it's something you might bring up if the child is present, or if you just happen to be there. It's not something you specifically come round and say. My dad was starting to get creepy vibes as well. So a few weeks later, we've got a similar situation where it's about midday, when my mum is home, but she's feeling a little sick, and she's just sleeping on the sofa with me nestled in her arms. Out of the blue, she hears a tapping noise. She looks over, and as it's fairly open plan, she can see the kitchen window from where she was positioned on the sofa. And the window starts being pushed open. She sees a head pop in, but the head did not see her. She stood motionless as the guy, the neighbor, started slowly pushing himself in through the kitchen window. He had to navigate through cutlery and recently washed dishes, and as he was trying to not make noise and get in through that window, did he spot my mum. They locked eyes for a few seconds, and he quickly rushed out the window, didn't even close the door, and legged it to his own house. My mum instantly shot up, called the police, but apparently nothing could be done because there was no proof he'd done anything. But my dad never spoke to him again. It took them a few weeks before they could find a new house to move into, as like I said, they weren't exactly swimming in cash at the time. But eventually we found a new place. Who knows what that guy wanted to do to me, or my mum? We'll never know. We're just glad we never found out. My boyfriend and I have been together just a little over 2 years now. I moved in basically right when we got together. It was all great at first. I met all his neighbours, and because of me he even started talking to some of them that he didn't before we got together. The first summer we were together, we decided to get a pool and put it in our backyard. We also started having bonfires since the weather was nice, and we have a decent sized yard. We had the pool up for about a month at this point, and we were having a bonfire with some friends one night and a few drinks. Suddenly the person who lives behind us across the alley walks up and starts talking to us. Note, we have never spoken to this neighbour before. It was all normal small talk, getting to know each other's names, talking about how long we've lived there, how he'd seen us out with our dog and how it's well behaved. Then it turns into talking about our pool. I just wish I could take a dip sometimes, you know. It's so hot and it just looks so fun. I see you both out there all the time. This strange neighbour says it's probably a good time to mention he's in his 50s, and me and my boyfriend are in our early 20s. My boyfriend, being the easygoing guy he is, didn't even notice that the comment was a bit weird and says, "No problem, man, anytime you want, just ask." I begin to look at my phone and say it's getting late and that we should probably turn in for the night. We say our goodbyes and figured it would all be over, and ended the night normally, but it wasn't the end. My boyfriend and I are on pretty close work schedules, him working Monday to Friday 7 till 5, and me working any day 8 to 5. One day I got off work a little early, came home, and the way our driveway is I can't see completely into our backyard because of part of the house blocks it. I get out my car and go into the house and into the kitchen and grab a drink. Our sink has a little hole window above it which looks out over the backyard with a clear view of the pool. I look out and saw none other than our creepy neighbour just floating in our pool. I freak out and call my boyfriend, who says just to stay in the house and that he'll finish up what he's doing and come home. I do so, and the creepy neighbour is gone by the time my boyfriend arrives. Now my boyfriend is kind of a hothead when it comes to privacy, and me feeling uncomfortable. So even though he was gone, my boyfriend was fuming. He understands that he gave him permission to swim in our pool, but he told him to ask first. So my boyfriend takes the ladder out of the pool and puts it in our mudroom, and locks the door so no one can get it. Later on in the night, luckily my boyfriend was calmed down, and saw the creepy neighbour outside with the dog and spoke to him about swimming in our pool without asking, and the creepy neighbour apologizes, saying it was a mistake and wouldn't happen again. You'd think it was over, but it wasn't. We started seeing him wandering around his backyard a lot more often than we had ever seen him do before, and in this time we had also talked to some other neighbours and learnt that he was apparently a child predator. We also learned he worked with our meth head neighbours who do carpentry, and that's another story in itself. To give you some background to the next part of the story, like I mentioned earlier, our kitchen has a window that looks out over the backyard, and right next to our kitchen is our bathroom, which has a huge window that also looks out over our backyard, which happens to be right in front of our mirror and washer and dryer. Also, since my boyfriend had been a bachelor before me, he hadn't taken much time in buying curtains or anything for the house, so the windows were just completely open. Also, so you can get a better picture, I may be in my early 20s, but I look as if I could be 16. We find out through neighbours who were decent friends with the meth heads that apparently the creepy neighbour had been talking about watching me undress and how he even tried to peek in other windows to try and see me in other places of the house. When my boyfriend hears this, he isn't happy. He begins to get even angrier every second, and you can see his face turning red. He, as calmly as possible, asks the nice neighbours that had told us this if they had a spare no trespassing sign they could have, since they just put some up in their yard. They did, and along with the stake to put it in the ground. He charges up to the house, grabs a hammer, and then in the backyard where he begins to scream about creepy neighbour being a paedophile and that he's a peeping Tom. He screams for 10 more minutes, causes a few people surrounding neighbours to come out and look, and all the while I'm sitting in the house feeling completely violated. He finally came in completely calm, hung a blanket on the bathroom window, and calmed me down since I was very freaked out. The next day I looked up his name, and he had actually been to prison for sexually abusing his niece and a few other things. Eventually he moved out and we never heard from him again. In the end, I know it was kind of stupid of me just to undress and be careless right in front of a huge window where anyone could see me, but I also thought I would be fine since I was in my own home. I'm just happy my boyfriend was there to look out for me. And I'm also thankful for my neighbours, who looked out for our house, and they still do, even though he's gone. I moved into a new apartment complex 2 weeks ago. For some context, there are approximately 16 buildings in the complex. Each building has 12 apartments in it. Before moving in, I had previously lived in 2 standalone houses. So, I knew it would take some getting used to. All of the sounds of the apartment living. I had been pleasantly surprised for the most part though, how quiet things seemed to be. That is, except for my neighbours across the hall. It's a mom, dad and their 3 young children, ages 1, 3 and 9. Initially, when meeting the parents, they seemed really friendly. The mum said she's a teacher, and the dad works for the apartment complex doing maintenance. Every single day the mum screams at her children. Initially I chalked it up to being cooped up inside with 3 little ones. I get it, parenting isn't easy. Also, I don't like to start any trouble and butt into people's business. The first week or so, I would just turn on the TV or the AC to tune out the noise. It began escalating though, until one day her screaming became too much. I thought about calling the police or going right across the hall and having a word with the mum, but decided neither of those would work. I was having an inner battle about what to do. I began listening closer and heard her calling her children stupid, as well as other horrible things. Every other word had a curse in it, and I decided to write a letter to the office of the apartment complex, thinking they could at least speak to them, since the dad works for them. They quickly got back to me and told me they would address it. Fast forward to later in the day. I noticed it was quiet across the hall and assumed the office had spoken to them, but wasn't 100% sure. At this point it's around 7 p.m. I decided to take my dog over to the dog park. As I was walking to the dog park, I have to walk across 2 parking lots. In the second lot, I have to walk all the way to the end past a row of garages. The entrance to the dog park is behind the garages, and that in itself is a bit unnerving as a petite 5'1" woman. As I was walking through the second part, an older Middle Eastern woman was walking towards me. It looked like she was coming from the park or one of the garages. I assumed she lived in one of the 2 buildings right there, and as she got closer I smiled and said hello, and she just stared at me, with no smile, no greeting, nothing. I thought perhaps she just couldn't speak English, and I continued towards the park. When I was walking past the row of garages, almost at the end of them, I turned into the dog park. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and noticed the woman walking a little ways behind me. When I turned around, she stopped and kind of looked around as if to not have me notice she was following me. Once again, weird. That being said, I wasn't too worried about it, as she was an older woman, plus if worse came to worse, I always carry a pocket knife on me, and I have my 50-pound dog who's very protective. I continued to the dog park, ignoring the woman. While collecting some tennis balls to throw to my dog, I looked up and noticed the woman standing at the edge of the parking lot, just outside of the dog park entrance. There is usually a big, lifted work truck that sits back there. She stood behind the truck, and all I could see were her legs, which were facing me. I knew for a fact that it's not her truck, which weirded me out even more. I continued playing with my dog while keeping the woman in my periphery, and after a few minutes I noticed her walk away. Okay, good. I was just being paranoid. Then, not 2 minutes later, she was back again. This time, though, just standing there, stretching and staring right at me. Again, I greet, say hello and wave, but she says nothing. and just carries on stretching. At this point, I'm texting a few people letting them know what's going on, because I'm just confused about the whole situation. I decide the next time she walks past, I would leave as well. And after 2 to 3 minutes, she walked away. Great. There was my opportunity. I tell my dog it's time to go, and quickly exit. I got a weird feeling, like she was waiting around the corner of the garages. So I took a wide turn so I wouldn't walk directly into her if she was standing there. Sure enough, she's walking our way again. I think I startled her. We quickly walk past, and this time I don't say anything. We get to the end of the parking lot and I turn around to see where this woman is, as my dog sniffs around the grass adjacent to the parking lot. This lady is walking towards us again. I say, "Hello, can I help you?" She doesn't even reply. She's still just coming towards us. I position myself so my dog and I are now facing her head on, and stare her down until she finally just turns and walks away. I jog back towards my building, but make sure to go around the long way so that she can't see where I live if she's still watching. When I get up to my apartment, I locked the door and took a deep breath, thinking I was just being paranoid. And I go to switch on my PS4, which I had just been using prior to taking my dog to the park. Like I turned it off as I was walking out the door. It didn't turn on. I tried a few more times and started looking closely at everything, but the power cord was missing. Now I'm thinking, what the hell? I know for a fact that it was there when I left. I reached out to my roommate, who's my sister, and a few other family members and asked them if they'd been in. They all said, "How high are you?" After a few minutes of feeling frustrated and confused, I went into my bedroom to grab something. And when I walked in, I noticed the power cord just sitting there on my desk. Now I'm freaking out. Why is it in my room? The PS4 is in the living room. There's no reason for the cord to be in my bedroom. My stomach drops. Someone must have been in my apartment. I search the place. Nothing. I call my sister and explain everything. She said, "What if it was the maintenance man across the hall? It's a weird coincidence that you just complained today, and now all this weirdness is taking place." I double-checked that the front door was locked, but realized he had keys if he really wants to get in. I immediately went out the next day and got indoor security cameras and have been hyper-vigilant of being aware of my surroundings since. I also know that the office talked to them because I haven't heard the mom scream at her kids in a few days. Did the maintenance man break into our apartment? Were the older women related or friends with them and watching me to tell them when I was going back to my place? I need answers. I grew up in a rural part of Ireland with only 2 neighbours. I lived on my great-grandparents' old small farm and had renovated the old barn into a garage for my dad to work as a mechanic. My closest neighbour was my dad's aunt-in-law, who never really bothered us. But our other neighbour, who we let use our lane as an easy access point to their house and farm, even though the other the lane going down to theirs was a much shorter method but a tight road for a milk tanker and silage harvester. You see, I had a large extended family with 14 or so cousins who were always at my house hanging out. 2 of my cousins who I got really close with, Mick and Jim, befriended the neighbour's middle child, George, and his family was always looking for my dad to help fix something, and George was always tagging along. We had so much fun together as kids, but everything got so much weirder as we grew up. George was about 14 when this started to happen. One day when I was 16 years of age, the neighbours needed their Jeep fixed, and when George was dropping it off at his dad, he realised that my parents weren't home. I noticed the back door was unlocked, so instead of knocking and calling our names, he walked into the house and up the stairs to my bedroom where I was sleeping, opened the bedroom door, and just stared at me while saying my name very quietly. I woke up confused as to what was going on. My family were loud and rambunctious, so someone quietly saying my name was definitely abnormal. I asked him what the hell he was doing, and his excuse was, No one was downstairs and I heard voices upstairs. The voices were my TV playing as I fell asleep. I passed it off as nothing and just got him out the house ASAP. I quickly dressed and wasn't freaking out about him seeing me. And when he left, I went down to my sister's room on the bottom floor and asked her if she heard George knock or come in. She was sitting there doing schoolwork and didn't hear a sound. Just the Jeep driving up, which is normal for my dad's family to use the garage. They all had keys to it, as it was just farming machinery, and she thought nothing of it. Another incident involving George was when my cousins Mick and Jim were invited to come hang out with us and play video games. Everything was fine that day until later in the evening, when Mick went to the bathroom and 2 minutes later, George disappeared after him. Not long after, Mick came back and asked if I'd seen George. He hadn't. Then I heard the floorboards creak from my bedroom, and as no one else was upstairs, so I was confused, I went up and found George in my closet snooping through my stuff. I grabbed him by the collar, pulled him out my room, and I was furious as no one was allowed in my room. I was a 17-year-old 5-foot noodle of a girl that had Asperger's syndrome and a bad mental health record, so to me, my room was my sanctuary. His excuse was that he was looking for Mick and thought he was up here. I was at this point screaming at him to never come near me or my room again, and about how creepy all of this was. All the while he kept laughing like it was a joke, and for me it wasn't. He was refusing to leave, so I did the only thing my dumb brain could think of, and that was to put him on his arse and drag him out myself. I swiped his feet and he fell to the ground and slid down the stairs, and this boy was at least 6 feet tall and weighed twice as much as me. It astounded my cousins and parents, who all came running to the bottom of the stairs and found him on his arse, starting to cry. My family were extremely confused but stayed calm and asked both of us what happened. Surprisingly, he told them what he had done and never made me out to be the bad guy. When I came downstairs about 5 minutes later, after a small cry, my family asked for the recall of the events and never punished me, but asked George to never come to this house again without my dad's knowledge, and that if he does, we will not let him use our lane anymore, as legally they had no right to use it. George never stepped foot in the house again, but would always speed down our road in anything he was on, whether it was a tractor or jeep. He even ran over our dog in his quad, ATV for the Americans. I had a lot of younger family members overall at the time, and we did think about putting up a gate, but the road was a huge street and was too wide unless we cement the post into the middle of the road. But he didn't care. He would purposely drive the tractor past our lane at 2 or 3 a.m., turning at the top of our lane. Instead, we put a cattle guard at the point where our lanes met their land. That made no difference, so my dad now has to park a vehicle, which is generally always his transit van, in the middle, so they purposely have to slow down to go around it. This all happened 4 years ago and I've barely seen him since, but I've moved out and into my own place with my boyfriend, who happened to go to school with George. My boyfriend was a few years older, but George was the same age and in the same class as my boyfriend's younger brother, and I'd heard from them that when George was 17 he was FaceTiming an 8-year-old girl and touching himself while talking to her. The young girl's mother walked in and sees what he's doing and files a police report, but on Facebook photos of the interaction. They had it all. He is now, from what I heard, on probation and has an ankle tag. What a creep. Let's never meet again. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment that has no security guards whatsoever, with one other roommate called Emily. It's important to note that a lot of people will ask Emily if we are twins. We look very similar. She and I both spend almost every night at our respective boyfriend's house and are rarely home. One night around 8:45, I was home cleaning before I left to go to see my boyfriend. I ran to get something from my car and came back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. 5 minutes after, I hear a knock at the door. I'm already a paranoid person, so I got a little scared. I knew it wasn't Emily because she would have called me to tell me she forgot her keys. I tried to ignore it, but hear a second knock. These also weren't innocent knocks. They sounded like a cop knock. Immediately after the second knock, I FaceTime my boyfriend. He's convincing me to look through the peephole. So I do, but there's no one there. At that point I say, okay, I'm gonna pack my stuff and come over. I take 2 steps back from the peephole and again the banging continues. Even my boyfriend's face dropped. I ran and locked myself in the bathroom, crying until he got there to fetch me, and no one was at the door. The next day my boyfriend and I stopped at my apartment so I could change and get ready for a Cinco de Mayo gathering. It was less than 8 people and stay local distance, and I got no knocks that day. The day after I went home, Emily was getting kitty litter and was going to meet me at the apartment since we were both too scared to be there alone. I get home and was sitting on my phone scrolling through TikTok, and about 10 minutes into doing so I hear the same knock. I look through the peephole and call Emily and describe to her what the guy looked like. She had no idea who it could be. I then watched him walk away and thought he will stop. Another 5 minutes passed, but he returned. I message Emily and FaceTime her, and she tells me to open the door. I opened, and the guy was a bit muscular. He looked a little bit older than me, and was someone who I'd never seen around my apartment complex before. He seemed shaken that I actually answered the door. Yes? Is this a bad time? I was just wondering, do you have a printer? No. Okay. At that point he slowly walks away. I thought it was weird that someone was asking for a printer, being that all classes were moved to online format, now that we're supposed to be in quarantine. And also, if you need a printer that bad and someone doesn't answer the first knock, why would you keep trying? Especially when you don't know the person. We told a bunch of people about the knocking in our complex, and one other apartment said that they'd had the same issues. They were also 2 girls living alone. The next day, Emily went back with her boyfriend, and as she was leaving the apartment she heard from a balcony next to ours, "Yo, is that her?" She turned around and 2 men ran back inside. We told the apartment complex and called the cops. They said that they couldn't really do much unless the guy was present at our door and knocking. After this, we installed a monitor detection camera and put up a sign in our window saying, "We have cameras, you're being recorded." Since then, Emily has moved out, and I have 2 new male roommates who are seen coming in and out of the apartment often, and no one has come to knock. So mystery knocker, let's not meet again. I moved into a great apartment in a nice area, where the majority of neighbours kept to their own business. I had met a few other neighbours, apart from the one guy who lived on the 3rd floor who drove a nice Audi, but walked around with a permanent scowl on his face. One time I had come back and saw his girlfriend packing loads of stuff into a taxi. As I was coming in, she asked for some help with the heavy box, so without even thinking about the situation I offered to assist, and assumed they were moving in and needed a taxi to finish. Poor decision on my part, when I found out his girlfriend had walked out on him taking their youngest son. Instead of knocking on my door, the guy proceeds to the front windows in front of the entire block and screams about how he's going to knock me out. This didn't last long as I didn't respond, as he assumed I wasn't in. I managed to dodge this guy for a long time, because he was always gone late at night. Fast forward to a day before, and I'm due to move out. I had been drinking with friends and came back from the bar on my very own and very drunk. The guy is outside the front of his car drinking a few beers, and he asks over to come over and have a chat. Common theme here of me making stupid mistakes. I was buzzing hard, so thought I'd love a beer and maybe we can settle our differences. He tells me he thought I knew his girlfriend was moving out. I told him I thought they both were, and we shared a laugh when he realized I had just innocently lent a hand. I decided to go and grab a few more beers, listen to some tunes and have a drive. Before we reach the shop, we turn into a very rundown area and the guy jumps in the back. The guy who jumps in gives a big roll of cash to my neighbor and a cling-fill wrap of Coke. They bust out a little bit, and when asking me if I've ever had it before, I stupidly took a line. The guy who jumped in leaves and we drive back to the flats. The whole time we are getting on and having a laugh. He invited me back to his where we play on his two sons' PlayStation. The beers are drank and I decide that it's late and obviously I need to sort out my apartment for the landlords to view it in the morning. The guy turns to me and says, "I've never felt like this for a guy." And he offered to give me an iPad to sleep with him. Meanwhile, his sons are sleeping next door. Well, believe you me, that comment made me instantly sober. I told the guy that it wasn't my thing, and he's trying to just give me the hard sell while sloppy drunk. I told him I was going downstairs to grab a joint and would be back up. I shut downstairs, locked both my doors, and tried to process what the hell just happened. "Where are you, man? You coming back?" He does this 4 times, getting to the point of anger, before finally leaving. I left next morning and hope to never meet him again. Since my childhood, I was told I had a very vivid imagination. Among my first memories, there are old buildings, and in their basement there are people with white painted faces trying to lure me down. I am from an Eastern European country, so there are these typical houses in big cities that have been having these dizzy effects on me since I was a child. In 2002, for example, my parents told me that it seemed off, as if I were about to faint when I was visiting a friend who lived in one of these houses. My parents, not being superstitious, were also kind of shocked to see what could have triggered this state of mine. Later, I discovered one of these houses when I was quite drunk to face my fears. I started from the cellar up to the attic. It was like a proper horror movie going from the cellar to the attic through the dusty objects that you couldn't tell whether they were real or figments of your imagination. Not to mention the drunkenness didn't help. Fast forward to the present. I had a breakup with my ex, so I was in need of finding a flat quick. I found one relatively cheap in a posher part of town, a nice tranquil neighborhood with young parents and old people. There are also playgrounds, cafes, restaurants, so we can conclude this is an ideal area for anyone who's looking for peace. Like I said, this was after a breakup, so I went out a lot. I had my share in alcohol, but never did I experience any unpleasant situation as far as old houses go. Having a lot of free time on my own, I started watching things to kill time. The first was on Netflix, something called Marianne. It's about a possessed old woman. You'll get the idea what I'm talking about when I mention that my neighbor looks very similar to her. Because one afternoon she knocked on the door telling me that her son was coming home. That was the icebreaker in this conversation. I politely nodded and introduced myself. I was the guy who was renting this flat. A few weeks went by and I was minding my own business when my doorbell rang. It was her, and she wanted me to check her cable TV. So being a nice neighbor, I said, "Sure, let us check." So we proceeded into her flat. If I have to describe her place, it was out of a Hoarders episode. The stench, the litter, the everything. After all, she's not that old. I mean, she could take care of her business if she was alright. But while I was looking around, I could tell that something was definitely amiss. The TV was on. It was a summer afternoon, but the air was filled with impending death. She couldn't locate the remote control among her stuff. The room was so filthy, so I couldn't help and said sorry and left. Another couple of days passed, and sometimes I met her on the street. Sometimes I smelt the stench coming from behind the door. But I'm in my mid-30s, so why should I be afraid? I had a job as a night watchman at a home for the elderly before this. Anyhow, after a night of light drinking prior to this virus, I went home. I was a bit tipsy, but nothing serious. A movie was on and I remember listening to some music. Mind you, it's quiet and a rich neighborhood, so I was quite taken aback when I heard a banging on the door, and allegedly the police wanted to be let in. I couldn't quite tell at which door they were yelling, so I opened the door and saw 2 police officers introduce myself and asked if I could help. They thanked me and told me the old lady can't come out and locked herself up in her flat. Now, you have to know that the doors on my floor are U-shaped, meaning I have a neighbor to my right, the lady, and there's another neighbor opposite to me. The door of the old lady's was open, but the barreled safety door in front of her entrance door was locked. You could see inside the apartment as the light was being slowly eaten by darkness and the stench. The 2 police officers went into the other apartment where a family lived, because as it turned out, there was an interconnected part between the 2 flats where the police officers could climb into her apartment, so they did. The reason I shared this with all of you is that I was left alone on the floor being able to gaze into the old lady's apartment. If you saw the movie Wreck 2, you know the apartment I'm talking about. I got my phone and started recording for I don't know how long, but I heard something that I would never wish to hear again. From the darkness, an almost animal-like howling, which was the mixture of human and something inhuman. It was so chilling and disturbing that I have goosebumps just thinking about it. The police officers concluded that the lady had forgotten to take her pills. She should be in a psychiatric institution, and that's why she was having nightmares and was half conscious of what was happening. Nobody knows if she has or had a son. At least this is what the people who I asked told me. Since then I see her frequently, sometimes standing on the stairs as if she's waiting for someone. It is really creepy. I understand it is an event, and I've been trying to avoid this my whole life. I also understand the old people in the old building have an obvious connection, but I was curious if anyone else might have these sensations or experiences of deep unpleasantness and uncomfortableness every time they see an older person, just like I do from now on. I used to go on night walks, but I don't anymore because summer nights seem to bring out the creeps. I was on my way home one night, and this dude was in his backyard leaning on his wall having a smoke. I thought nothing of it and started to walk past. By the way, I always have my box cutter in my shoe for protection because my pockets are either fake or non-existent or just too small, as other girls will know. He called out to me, "Hey pretty, come here. Hey beautiful, want to join my pool party?" I didn't know if he had a pool, but there was definitely no party. "Hey cutie, let's have some fun." I walked about a block away from him and fixed my shoe in case I needed to run, and pulled out my small makeshift weapon. He didn't follow me, this time. I went on several more walks, walking in the opposite direction on the other side of the road and such to go home. But he was never in his backyard again until one night when I was walking home from a night walk. He was there again in his backyard at the wall, calling out to me to go to him and typical creepy stuff. I had a feeling that I had to pull out my blade immediately. So I did, and then I heard shoes hit the ground. I looked back, and I saw him jump his wall and him start approaching me. I was on the other side of the road, so I started booking it to my apartment complex. I hopped the wall into my backyard, and my back door has a sliding screen door and then a sliding glass door. Only the glass door can lock, and part of the screen, the part that doesn't slide off, we have to get the manager to fix it. But it's angled against the wall out of the way, and this is an important detail. I tried the glass door, but apparently when I was out, my mum locked it. She knows I go out on walks at night, and she doesn't want me in the apartment at all. The instant I found the glass door locked, I slid under the screen angled against the wall in just enough time. A few seconds later, he rounds the corner, and I can kind of see through the screen. If I look really hard, I see him walk past my hiding spot and back down the street towards his house. I started texting and calling my mum to let me inside. And about an hour or two later, when my phone is about to die, does she finally unlock the glass door and opens it, because she doesn't see me because I'm still hiding under the screen. I come out from it, and she asks me why I was hiding, and I tell her, and she calls me a bunch of names before telling me I should have just let him kill me. Frustrated at my mum and scared, I text my friend. Because of what happened, I messaged my friend all the creepy things that had happened, and he had the audacity to text back, "If you dressed differently or took a different route home, this wouldn't happen. This never happens to me because I'm smarter than that. I always wear a black t-shirt, long sleeved or leggings, so I don't know what they're on about. In any case, creepy neighbor, let's not meet again." Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. If you did, be sure to let me know down below. I'd like to extend as always a huge thanks to my wonderful patrons and members. If you'd like to sign up and join, feel free, info in the description. My voice has gone a bit gravelly right now, shame really. So I hope you liked the video anyway. I should probably look into throat exercises. Thank you everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.